We are often taught that the great conquerors of history sought dominion over land and subjects, to rule the living. But hidden behind the veil of antiquity lies a shadow whose ambition was far more terrifying. He did not merely seek to rule cities, but to unmake them completely. This is the chronicle of Tamerlane, a strategist of such calculated cruelty that he turned the very act of destruction into an architectural aesthetic. From the living graves of Sivas to the silent skull towers of Baghdad, his legacy is not written in ink, but in the ashes of erased civilizations. As you listen from the safety of your own home, do whisper in the comments which city you are watching from. Prepare yourself. We are about to descend into a darkness that history tries to forget. To truly comprehend the anatomy of this terror, we must first look into the eyes of the architect himself. He was not merely a warlord born of dust and fury, but a paradox wrapped in silk and steel. Born in the year 1336, under the violet shadows of the Chagatai Khanate in modern-day Uzbekistan, his name was Timur. Yet history, with its cruel tendency to label the dangerous, would come to know him by his deformity. An arrow wound taken in his youth had shattered his leg, leaving him permanently maimed. Timur Ileng, Timur the Lame, or as the trembling lips of the West would whisper it, Tamerlane. But one mustn't mistake physical frailty for weakness. The Spanish ambassador Ruy González de Clavijo, who stood before the conqueror in his twilight years, described not a broken man, but a presence of overwhelming gravity. The limp did not humble him. It merely gave his gait a terrifying, rhythmic cadence. It was the walk of a predator that need not rush, for it knows the prey has nowhere to run. He was a man who could discuss the intricate geometries of chess with the complexity of a grandmaster and recite Persian poetry with the soul of a lover, yet possessed a heart that had long ago ceased to beat with anything resembling human empathy. He did not seek to govern the world as Genghis Khan had done. He sought to break it, to reshape it into a monument to his own terrifying will. Our descent into his abyss begins in the year 1400, at the gates of Sivas, located in the heart of Anatolia. Sivas was a jewel of trade and culture, a city whose walls had withstood the passage of time, but had never faced a force of nature like the Timurid army. The defenders, a garrison largely composed of Armenian Christians, looked out from their battlements and saw the horizon swallowed by a sea of cavalry. They knew the stories. They knew that resistance against Tamerlane was usually a suicide pact. But they fought, fueled by that desperate, primal hope that perhaps, just perhaps, their stone walls would hold. They did not. As the siege dragged on and the supplies dwindled, the psychological weight began to crush the spirit of the city. It was then that Tamerlane played his masterstroke. He did not breach the walls with battering rams. He breached them with a promise. He sent emissaries to the garrison with a proposition that seemed almost merciful. If they surrendered, if they laid down their arms and opened the gates, he swore a solemn oath before God. His exact words, recorded by the chroniclers of the time, were binding and specific. No blood shall be shed. In the medieval world, an oath was the currency of honor. Even monsters were expected to adhere to the sanctity of a vow, especially one made with religious invocation. The commanders of Sivas, exhausted, starving, and looking into the hollow eyes of their men, made the choice that any rational leader would make. They chose life. The heavy gates groaned open, a sound that must have felt like a sigh of relief to the thousands of soldiers inside. They marched out, laying their swords and shields in a pile, surrendering themselves to the mercy of the Lame Conqueror. But they had failed to understand the legalistic cruelty of the man they faced. Tamerlane watched them with a gaze that was unreadable, devoid of triumph or pity. He had promised that no blood would be shed, and Tamerlane was a man of his word. The order was given swiftly. The surrendered soldiers, thousands of them, were not put to the sword. They were not beheaded. They were not shot with arrows. Instead, they were herded towards pre-dug trenches. Vast moors opened in the earth. One can only imagine the confusion at first, followed by the dawning, horrific realization. They were bound, hand and foot, and cast into the pits. This is where the true nightmare begins. Not with the flash of steel, but with the dull, rhythmic sound of shovels hitting the earth. Tamerlane intended to keep his promise technically pure. If he buried them alive, no blood would be spilled. Imagine, if you can bear it, the sensory experience of those final moments. It is not the sharp pain of a wound, but the crushing claustrophobia of the inevitable. The first shovel of dirt falls upon your face, gritty and cold. You shake it off, looking up at the circle of sky that is slowly, methodically shrinking. You scream, but the sound is swallowed by the earth. Then comes the next load, and the next. The weight begins to press against your chest, making each breath a labor, a desperate struggle against the soil that seeks to fill your lungs. There is no glory in this death. There is no adrenaline of combat. There is only the damp smell of the grave, the taste of minerals, and the terrifying transition from light to twilight, to absolute, suffocating darkness. The chroniclers tell us that the groans from beneath the earth could be heard for hours, a muffled, collective plea that slowly faded into silence. Tamerlane rode his horse over the fresh mounds, his limp forgotten as he sat high in the saddle, satisfied that his oath remained unbroken. He had killed 4,000 men without spilling a drop of their blood. It was a lesson in theology, twisted into a weapon of terror. It sent a message to every city that lay in his path. Do not listen to his words, for his mercy is merely a different kind of execution. But Sivas, with its suffocated garrison, was merely the prologue. The world had seen his cruelty, but it had not yet seen his capacity for total, existential erasure. That was reserved for the city of Urgench. As the dust settled over the graves of Sivas, Tamerlane turned his gaze eastward, towards the wealthy trading hub of Urgench, the capital of Khwarezm. This city had committed a sin far greater than resistance. It had committed the sin of betrayal. It had rebelled. And for Tamerlane, rebellion was not a political inconvenience. It was a personal insult that required a response so absolute, so thorough, that it would challenge the very concept of ruins. Most conquerors destroy a city to loot it. They burn the houses but leave the foundations. They enslave the people but leave the streets. Tamerlane, however, looked at Urgench and decided that it should simply cease to be. The destruction of Urgench in 1388 stands as a singular moment in the history of warfare, a moment where the objective shifted from conquest to uncreation. Tamerlane did not merely wish to punish the inhabitants for their rebellion. He wished to punish the geography itself for having hosted them. When the city walls were finally breached, the order that descended from the commander's tent was terrifying in its mundane practicality. He did not order a firestorm, for fire leaves charred remains, and remains imply existence. Instead, he ordered the city to be submerged. He commanded his engineers to divert the course of the river Amu Darya, forcing the waters to wash over the site where the city stood. But water was not enough to satisfy his disdain. Once the flood had done its work, Tamerlane commanded his soldiers to engage in a task of manual dismantling that defies belief. They were ordered to pull the city apart, stone by stone, brick by brick. Palaces that had taken generations to construct were reduced to gravel by the hands of men who worked with the grim determination of grave diggers. And then, in a final gesture of contempt that borders on the ritualistic, Tamerlane ordered barley to be sown over the ground where the city once stood. Consider the symbolism of this act. Barley is a crop of the field, a plant of the wild and the rural. By planting it over the ruins, He was declaring to history that this place was never a city at all. He was returning it to nature, forcing a sophisticated metropolis to regress into farmland. It was a metaphysical erasure. If a traveller were to pass by years later, they would see only a swaying field of grain, with no hint that beneath the roots lay the crushed dreams of a civilization. Urgench was not just destroyed, it was annulled. If Urgench was a lesson in physical erasure, then the Persian city of Isfahan would become the canvas for a different kind of horror, one that focused on the architectural arrangement of the human form. The year was 1387, and Isfahan, a shining beacon of Islamic scholarship and art, initially made the prudent choice. When the Timurid army arrived, the city surrendered without a fight. The gates were thrown open, and for a brief, deceptive moment, it seemed that the angel of death would pass over them. Tamerlane accepted their submission. He installed his tax collectors, stationed a garrison of some 6,000 soldiers, and moved on. The people of Isfahan breathed a collective sigh of relief. They had traded their pride for their lives, a bargain that seemed reasonable in the face of such a monster. But the human heart is a volatile thing, prone to forgetting fear when the sword is no longer pressed against the throat, chafing under the heavy taxes and the arrogance of the occupiers. A mob began to form in the twisting streets of Isfahan. The whispers of rebellion turned into shouts, and shouts turned into violence. In a sudden, chaotic night of uprising, the citizens turned on the Timurid garrison. They hunted down the tax collectors and the soldiers, killing them and dragging their bodies through the streets. It was a moment of triumphant defiance, a reclaiming of their city. But they had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They assumed Tamerlane was a mere warlord who could be repelled. They forgot they were dealing with a force of nature. When the news reached Tamerlane, he did not rage. He did not scream. He simply turned his army around. The return to Isfahan was swift, and the mood was not one of battle, but of extermination. This time, there would be no negotiations. There would be no taxes. Tamerlane decreed that the city had forfeited its right to exist in its human form. He instituted a system that is perhaps the most chilling example of bureaucratic mass murder in history. He did not simply tell his soldiers to kill. He gave them a quota. Every unit, every squad, and in some accounts, every single soldier was required to bring back a specific number of severed heads. It was a tax paid in biology. The chroniclers state that the quota was set at 70,000 heads. Imagine the atmosphere that such an order creates within an army. It turns soldiers into hunters and civilians into currency. The slaughter that followed was not a frenzy of passion, but a methodical harvest. The streets of Isfahan, once famous for their poetry and trade, became slaughterhouses. Soldiers, fearful of failing their commander, scoured the houses, the mosques, the gardens. No one was spared. The old, the young, the scholars, the merchants, all fell beneath the blade to meet the grim tally. But Tamerlane had no intention of letting these dead simply rot in the sun. He was an architect of terror, and he needed a monument that would speak to the ages. He ordered the heads to be collected, stripped of their flesh, and used as building materials. Outside the city gates, his engineers began to construct towers. These were not haphazard piles. They were structures built with geometric precision. Layers of mud and mortar were mixed with the skulls, facing outward, so that thousands of empty eye sockets would stare eternally at the horizon. Some accounts describe 28 towers. Others say there were more. Each tower stood as a grotesque obelisk, a lighthouse of death cemented with the remains of fathers, mothers, and children. The chronicler Hafizi Abru, who witnessed the aftermath, wrote of the overwhelming stench that hung over the city like a poisonous fog. But more terrifying than the smell was the message. These towers were not hidden. They were placed on the main roads, the arteries of trade, Tamerlane wanted every merchant on the Silk Road, every ambassador, every traveller to pass by these structures. He wanted them to look up at the 40-foot-high pillars of bone and understand a simple, brutal truth. This is the price of defying the emir. Isfahan became a city of ghosts, guarded by the dead, and yet, as horrific as the skull towers were, they were stationary. They were punishments inflicted on those who had already fallen. As Tamerlane turned his eyes south, towards the riches of India, he would face a logistical problem that would force him to commit an act of slaughter so rapid, so immense, that it would make the slow construction of skull towers seem almost intimate by comparison. The road to Delhi was open, and it would soon be paved with the ashes of 100,000 souls. The year was 1398, and the shadow of Tamerlane had lengthened until it touched the mountain passes of the Hindu Kush. He was now an old man by the standards of his time, 62 years of age, a time when most warriors would be content to sit by the fire and recount their glories. But Tamerlane was possessed by a hunger that knew no satiety. His eyes turned south, towards the fabled riches of India, towards the Sultanate of Delhi. His justification for this invasion was a masterclass in cynicism. He claimed that the Muslim sultans of Delhi were too lenient, too soft in their treatment of their Hindu subjects. It was a religious pretext for a campaign of pure plunder. But as his army descended from the mountains like a slow-moving avalanche, a logistical nightmare began to form. One that would lead to perhaps the single coldest act of mass murder in medieval history. As the Timurid forces swept through the countryside, they did what they always did. They enslaved. Anyone who was not killed was taken captive. By the time Tamerlane arrived at the outskirts of Delhi, his army was dragging behind it a tale of humanity so vast it defied counting. The chroniclers estimate there were 100,000 Hindu prisoners, men, women, and children, a walking city of captives, bound in chains and fear. On the eve of the great battle against Sultan Mahmud, Tamerlane looked at the sea of prisoners and saw a tactical liability. What if, in the heat of combat, these 100,000 people realized they outnumbered their guards? What if they rebelled behind his lines? A lesser commander might have strengthened the guard. A cruel commander might have decimated them to instill fear. Tamerlane, the supreme pragmatist, chose a third option. He ordered them all to be neutralized. It was not a decision born of anger. It was a housekeeping measure, a cleaning of the board before the game began. The order went out to the camp. Every soldier who possessed a slave must execute them immediately. The penalty for disobedience was death. And so, in the span of a single horrific hour, the camp of Tamerlane was transformed into an abattoir. 100,000 people. Try to visualize that number. It is the population of a modern suburb. It is a stadium filled to capacity. And in the dusty plains outside Delhi, they were systematically erased. The chroniclers speak of the silence that followed. There was no battle cry, no clash of steel against steel, only the dull thud of bodies falling and the dry wind sweeping over a fresh harvest of death. Even the hardened veterans of Tamerlane's army, men who had seen the worst of humanity, were said to be shaken by the sheer industrial scale of the slaughter. With his rear lines now secure in the most ghastly way possible, Tamerlane turned his attention to the army of Delhi. But here, he faced a threat unlike any he had encountered on the steppes. The Sultan Mahmud had deployed a weapon that was the medieval equivalent of a tank division. 120 war elephants. These were not the gentle giants of the wild. These were beasts bred for violence. Their tusks tipped with poisoned scimitars, their bodies draped in chainmail armor, and on their backs, towers filled with archers and throwers of Greek fire. A cavalry charge against such a wall of muscle and iron would be suicide. The horses would panic, the lines would break. The soldiers of Tamerlane, brave as they were, trembled at the sight of these grey mountains moving towards them. But Tamerlane did not tremble. He calculated. He knew the psychology of beasts, just as he knew the psychology of men. He ordered his men to gather the baggage camels. The beasts of burden usually kept far from the front lines. He had them loaded with heavy bundles of dry hay, wood, and oil. As the line of war elephants charged, shaking the earth with their thunderous stride, Tamerlane gave the signal. His soldiers set the loads on the camels' backs on fire. Then, they prodded the screaming, burning animals forward, whipping them towards the enemy lines. Imagine the surreal horror of that tableau, a wave of living fire rushing to meet a wall of armored flesh. The camels, mad with pain and terror, ran straight at the elephants. The result was chaos absolute. The war elephants, for all their training, were still animals. Confronted with these screeching, flaming apparitions, they panicked. They did not smash into Tamerlane's lines. Instead, they turned, trumpeting in terror. The great beasts stampeded backward, crushing their own infantry, trampling the Sultan's army into the dust. The unbeatable weapon of Delhi became the instrument of its own destruction. The battle turned into a rout. The Sultan fled, and the gates of Delhi lay open. What followed was the sack of Delhi, an event so catastrophic that it effectively ended the city's golden age. Tamerlane's soldiers, unpaid and hungry for loot, were unleashed. For days, the city was a theatre of unchecked violence. The streets became impassable, choked with the debris of ruined lives. The accumulated wealth of centuries, gold, rubies, silks, and spices, was stripped away. But Tamerlane, ever the curator of his own legend, did not just steal gold. He stole talent. He ordered that all the stonemasons, the architects, and the artisans of Delhi be spared, but enslaved. They were to be marched back to his capital in Samarkand to build a mosque that would commemorate his victory. He literally dismantled the culture of Delhi to embellish his own. When the Timurid army finally packed up their tents and began the long march home, they left behind a city that was not merely defeated, but dead. The chroniclers wrote that for a full 2 months after Tamerlane's departure, not a bird moved a wing in Delhi. The city was abandoned. The stench of death was so overpowering that the survivors could not return. Famine and pestilence followed in the conqueror's wake, finishing what the sword had started. It would take nearly a century for Delhi to recover its former glory. Tamerlane had proven that he could defeat man, beast, and civilization itself. But his hunger was not yet satiated. There was one more city, a city of legendary status, that would dare to defy him. And for them, he would reserve his most systematic, his most bureaucratic, and his most chilling punishment yet. The final act of our tragedy awaits in the ancient capital of Baghdad. And so we arrive at the final circle of this inferno, the city of Baghdad. By the year 1401, Baghdad was no longer the glistening center of the Golden Age, but it remained a city of immense prestige, a symbol of history itself. Tamerlane had conquered it once before, and the city had bowed its head. But while the emir was distracted by his campaigns in the west, the ruler of Baghdad returned, and the city threw off the Timurid yoke. They raised their banners in defiance, believing perhaps that the old wolf was too tired, too distant to return. It was a fatal error. To betray Tamerlane once was a tragedy. To betray him twice was a suicide note written in blood. The siege was brutal. The heat of the Mesopotamian summer beat down upon the walls, baking the mud bricks and the men who defended them. But when the walls finally crumbled, Tamerlane did not merely unleash his army. He unleashed a policy that would make the horrors of Isfahan and Delhi seem restrained. In Isfahan, the quota had been 1 head per soldier. In Baghdad, Tamerlane adjusted the inflation of death. He ordered that every single soldier in his army, and there were tens of thousands of them, must return with no fewer than 2 human heads. 2 heads. Consider the arithmetic of that order. It meant that the slaughter had to be double the population of the army. It transformed the sack of the city into a frantic, desperate race. Soldiers were no longer fighting for glory or loot. They were fighting to save their own skins from the wrath of their commander. If they did not produce 2 heads, they would lose their own. What happens to the human soul under such pressure? The chronicles give us a glimpse into the abyss. They speak of a frenzy that consumed the army. Soldiers scoured the cellars, the rooftops, the mosques, but as the population dwindled and the quota remained unmet, the definitions of enemy began to dissolve. We are told by the Arab historian Ibn Arabshah that when soldiers could not find enough citizens to kill, they turned on their own prisoners. They executed the slaves they had captured in previous campaigns, and in the darkest whispers of the texts, there are accounts of soldiers who, in a weeping panic, severed the heads of their own wives who travelled with the camp, purely to meet the demands of the quota. Whether this specific detail is fact or the exaggeration of a traumatized chronicler matters little. The truth it conveys is undeniable. Tamerlane had created a system where the only way to survive was to become a monster. He had successfully outsourced his sociopathy to 90,000 men. When the dust settled, Baghdad was a silence. The great libraries, which held the accumulated wisdom of centuries, were scattered to the winds. The mosques remained standing, solitary witnesses to the carnage, but the congregation was gone, and in their place rose the architecture of the emir. 120 towers, not 28 as in Isfahan, 120 towers built from the severed heads of the fallen. They stood like sentinel trees in a forest of death, marking the landscape with a geometry of bone. It was Tamerlane's final masterpiece, a statement that no history, no culture, no sanctity could protect you from his will. 4 years later, in the winter of 1405, the architect of terror finally met an adversary he could not bribe, intimidate, or bury. While marching towards China, intent on yet another conquest, Tamerlane fell ill. The winter winds of the steppes, the same winds that had birthed him, now came to claim him. He died, not on a throne, but in a tent. His body ravaged by fever, his breath rattling in his chest like dry leaves. His empire, built on the fragile foundation of fear, did not survive him long. Within a generation, his descendants were squabbling over the scraps. The skull towers of Baghdad and Isfahan eventually crumbled, the bone returning to dust, the mortar washing away in the rain. But Tamerlane succeeded in the only conquest that truly matters to men of his ilk. He achieved immortality. 6 centuries have passed since his heart stopped beating. The cities he destroyed have been rebuilt. The rivers he diverted have returned to their courses. And yet, we are still speaking his name. We are still dissecting his cruelty. In the safety of our modern world, we are still compelled to look into the darkness he left behind. We tell ourselves that such monsters are anomalies, glitches in the human code. We tell ourselves that civilization has evolved beyond the need for skull towers and living graves. But perhaps that is the final lie we tell to sleep at night. For Tamerlane was not a demon summoned from the underworld. He was a man. He was one of us. And he showed us, with terrifying clarity, what human beings are capable of doing when the restraints of conscience are removed, and absolute power is placed in the hands of the absolute will. The towers are gone, but the foundation remains, and one has to wonder, in the shadowed corners of our own history, what new architects are waiting for their chance to build?